I was the Alpha Queen's silent servant, until the Alpha King found her marks on my skin. The wind howled across the jagged cliffs surrounding the Alpha Queen's castle, a vast fortress of black stone that rose like a dark crown above the kingdom. Rain struck the towers in heavy sheets, the sound echoing through the empty streets like distant drums. Within its walls, shadows moved along the corridors, each step muffled by thick carpets and silent duty. One of these shadows was the servant, quiet, unseen, unnoticed by all, except perhaps by those who were already accustomed to looking too closely. The servant's name had long been forgotten, or perhaps never truly known, even to themselves. They had been born into chains they could not escape, destined to serve the Alpha Queen, whose power stretched like a river across the land. Yet even beneath the weight of service, the servant bore another secret, marks upon their skin. Faint, almost invisible sigils that glimmered only under certain light, etched by forces older than any memory, the remnants of a curse that bound them in silence. Each day, the servant moved like a whisper through the palace. They cleaned the grand halls, arranged the queen's robes, carried messages, and followed her orders without question. In the presence of others, they were invisible. They spoke only when spoken to, and even then, with a careful, measured tone. But invisibility came at a cost. The servant often felt eyes watching from the shadows, eyes that could see more than the body. They had learned to hide fear behind calmness, anxiety behind obedience, and longing behind neutral expressions. They had learned the queen's moods, the subtle changes in her steps, the almost imperceptible shifts in her voice. To survive was to serve silently, and to serve silently was to survive. The queen, for all her grandeur, was a figure of fascination and terror. Her long robes trailed like rivers of midnight, and her eyes gleamed with a sharp intelligence that pierced the hearts of all who dared meet her gaze. She was not cruel without reason. Her judgments were precise, like the strike of a blade. Yet she carried an air of sorrow, subtle and fleeting, that sometimes softened her otherwise imperious demeanor. It was during these fleeting moments that the servant felt the smallest spark of connection, though they knew it was dangerous. To notice her sorrow was to risk drawing attention to themselves. Yet sometimes, the queen would pause at a window, gaze at the distant horizon, and for a moment she seemed almost human, almost vulnerable. The servant often watched from the shadows, heart beating in quiet rhythm with the queen's silent longing. On one stormy evening, the queen summoned the servant. The halls were darker than usual, lit only by torches whose flames danced against the stone walls. The sound of rain outside mixed with the servant's footsteps, each echo marking their approach. "You have been quiet," the queen said, her voice carrying through the chamber like wind over cliffs. "Too quiet." "Yes, your majesty," the servant replied, bowing slightly. The queen's gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and the servant felt the familiar tug of unease, a reminder that nothing in this castle was truly ordinary. "You move like a shadow," the queen said, "but shadows can hide secrets. Do you have secrets?" The servant swallowed, words caught in their throat. They knew better than to lie, yet the truth was dangerous. The marks, hidden beneath layers of clothing, were more than mere scars. They were chains, reminders of a curse that had followed their family for generations. "No, your majesty," the servant whispered, voice barely audible. The queen's eyes narrowed, but she did not press further. Instead, she dismissed them with a flick of her hand, and the servant retreated into the halls, heart still pounding. In the quiet of the corridor, they touched the marks through their clothing, feeling the faint ridges beneath their skin. No one knew what these sigils meant, not even the servant fully. Yet they were reminders of the power that dictated their life, a power that might one day demand more than obedience. Days passed, each one a careful repetition of tasks, of keeping silent, of moving without being noticed. The storm outside subsided, leaving the air crisp and heavy with the scent of wet stone. It was during this calm that rumors spread through the kingdom. The Alpha King was coming. He was said to be a man of immense power, a ruler who carried the weight of kingdoms on his shoulders and the secrets of the supernatural in his blood. His arrival was whispered about with awe and fear. Some claimed he could see through lies, through walls, even through hearts. Others said he brought change wherever he stepped, whether for good or ill. The servant heard these rumors and felt a strange stirring inside them, a mixture of fear and curiosity. Their life had been a series of shadows, each day blending into the next. But the idea of someone who could see past shadows, who might notice what was hidden on their skin, sent both dread and anticipation coursing through their veins. When the king finally arrived, the castle trembled under the weight of his presence. Guards bowed lower, servants hurried faster, and the queen herself seemed momentarily tense. The king entered the hall like a storm contained within a human form, his eyes sweeping across the room with sharp precision. It was then that he noticed the servant. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker, like lightning in the storm, and the servant felt a jolt deep in their chest. The king's gaze lingered on the faint marks that peeked from under the servant's sleeve, sigils they had hidden from the world. He did not speak, did not move closer, yet the awareness of being seen, truly seen, was more powerful than any command. Later that evening, the servant cleaned the queen's private chambers, hands trembling despite the calm mask on their face. They replayed the encounter over and over, heart pounding, mind racing. What did he see? Did he know what the marks meant? Could someone else bear witness to their curse without condemning them? And yet, amid the fear, there was something else, a strange, forbidden thrill. The king had looked at them differently than anyone had before. He had seen them, and in that moment the servant wondered if the chains that bound them might one day be broken. As midnight approached, the queen summoned the servant once more. The room smelled of polished wood and candle smoke. The queen stood at the window, looking out over the kingdom, her silhouette framed by the silver light of the moon. "You are quiet," the queen said again, almost to herself. "And yet I feel you are more than you let the world see." The servant bowed, heart hammering. They had served silently for so long, trained to hide even the smallest flicker of emotion. Yet now, standing in the presence of the queen and knowing that the king had already noticed, their thoughts swirled with impossible questions. "Do not forget," the queen added softly, her voice almost a whisper, "even shadows can be dangerous. Even silence can speak." The servant nodded, words failing them. The queen dismissed them and they left the room, hands trembling, mind racing with secrets and possibilities. That night they lingered in the quiet hallways, listening to the wind outside, feeling the rain against the stone. Their fingers traced the marks beneath their sleeves, a silent reminder of the life they had been given and the chains they had inherited. Somewhere in the shadows, the king moved through the castle, a presence felt more than seen. And though the servant did not yet understand what it meant, they knew that their world was changing. By the first light of dawn, the castle had transformed. The air buzzed with tension, the promise of storms both outside and within. The servant moved through the halls as always, silent, careful, watching, waiting. Yet now there was something new, the knowledge that someone else had seen the marks, that someone else might understand. And in the quiet of their own heart, a tiny spark of hope flickered, a dangerous, thrilling spark, one that promised both salvation and peril. The servant did not know what the day would bring, only that nothing would ever be the same again. And when the Alpha King's gaze fell upon them again, lingering for just a moment too long, the servant felt a shiver of both fear and longing. The storm that had raged outside was nothing compared to the storm that had begun within. For the first time in their life, the servant realized that their silence was no longer enough, that being unseen might no longer protect them. The marks on their skin had been found, and with them, a door to a world of unknown power, danger, and desire had opened. And so the shadows of service continued, but the light of possibility had begun to creep in, fragile and trembling, promising a future that could change everything. The castle of the Alpha Queen had never felt so alive. The servants whispered in corners, the torches burned brighter than usual, and even the wind seemed to carry the tension through the halls. The Alpha King had arrived, and with him came a presence that shifted everything. Some claimed he carried the storm with him, though the sky above was clear. Others whispered that his eyes could see the truths hidden deep within the soul. The servant moved quietly through the corridors, hands brushing against the cold stone walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of fatigue, but because of the memory of the king's gaze. Those eyes had lingered on the faint marks on their skin, sigils hidden for years. No one had ever seen them, not even the queen, and now someone had. In the palace garden that night, the air was thick with mist. The moon hung low and round, casting silver light across the dewy grass and the statues of past rulers, their faces frozen in eternal judgment. The servant walked silently, tending to the flowers and arranging the paths as they had done for years. But tonight, the world felt different, sharper, alive, and threatening. A soft sound of footsteps echoed behind them. The servant's heart skipped, and they turned quickly. There he stood, the Alpha King, tall, commanding, yet strangely calm. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned them carefully. "You work even when the world sleeps," he said, his voice low, almost melodic. "Do you not tire?" The servant bowed. "No, your majesty, it is my duty." "But duty is only part of life," he said, stepping closer. "I see more than just service in you. I see a weight, a secret you carry." The servant stiffened. Their mind raced. How much did he know? The marks, the curse. They had hidden it so well. I carry only what I must," the servant replied cautiously. The king's gaze dropped for a moment to their forearm, where the faintest glow of the sigils peeked beneath the sleeve. He did not touch them, but the recognition in his eyes was undeniable. "These marks," he said quietly, "they are old, very old. They speak of chains and debts, of promises made before either of us was born." The servant swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken of the curse like that before. It was not a story to be told lightly, not even to themselves. Yet here he was, standing in the quiet of the moonlit garden, speaking truths that had been buried for generations. "I do not understand," the servant whispered. "You will," the king said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Some things take time, some things take courage, and some require trust." The servant felt a tremor in their chest. Trust was not something they had ever known. It had been denied to them from birth. The queen demanded obedience, not friendship, silence, not understanding. And now this stranger, this powerful king, asked for something they had never dared give. The servant began but stopped. Words seemed too fragile for the moment. The king stepped closer, his presence overwhelming but not cruel. "You are not alone in your burden," he said softly. "Not anymore. But you must decide. Will you hide, or will you let someone see you?" The servant's hands trembled slightly. The marks burned faintly beneath their skin, as if awakening in response to his words. They looked away, afraid that any sign of emotion might betray too much. Yet the king did not move away. He waited, patient, as though he understood that some walls took time to break. I have always been hidden," the servant admitted finally. "Even from the queen, I am just a shadow." "Shadows can hide more than faces," the king said. "They can hide pain, hope, even power, and sometimes they can hide the key to freedom." The servant's heart raced. Freedom was a word they had only dared whisper in the darkest corners of the castle. The curse that bore the marks on their skin had chained them to silence, to service, to a life that was not truly theirs. And now, the king's words hinted at something impossible, a way out. "What do you mean?" the servant asked, voice barely audible. "Chains are not always broken with force," the king replied. "Some chains require understanding, courage, and choice. I know what these marks mean, though I do not know all their power. But together, perhaps we can learn. The servant froze. Together, could they trust him? Could they even hope? The king stepped closer still, his gaze searching theirs, not with judgment but with recognition. You have carried this burden alone for too long. Let me help you. Let me see the parts of you that the world fears, that the queen does not notice. The servant's mind spun. Trusting him was dangerous. The queen would never forgive disobedience. And yet, something inside them longed to be seen, to be understood. For the first time, the servant considered a world where their silence was not the only way to survive. I do not know if I can, the servant whispered. You can, the king said softly, almost a whisper himself. And you will, but only if you allow yourself to try. The wind stirred, rustling the leaves of the garden, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from earlier storms. The night felt alive, electric with possibility and danger. The servant looked at the marks on their arm, tracing the faint sigils with trembling fingers. These symbols had been a curse, a chain, a secret that defined their life. And now someone else knew, someone who might help. A sound behind them made the servant jump, a guard passing the garden, unaware of the exchange. The king smiled faintly and stepped back into the shadows. We have time, he said quietly, but you must be careful. The queen notices everything, and she notices when shadows shift. The servant nodded, heart pounding, mind spinning with thoughts they had never dared speak aloud. The king's presence lingered even after he disappeared into the darkness. The following days were a delicate dance. The servant continued their duties with silent efficiency, yet every glance over the shoulder, every shadow that moved differently, reminded them of the king's words. His knowledge, his attention, and the possibility of trust hung over them like a fragile thread. Meanwhile, the queen remained as inscrutable as ever. She watched the halls with sharp eyes, her presence a constant reminder of power and expectation. The servant could feel her gaze even when she was not there, a weight that pressed against their chest like stone. The queen was merciless in her way, yet sometimes, fleetingly, they glimpsed a softer side. A sigh that escaped in the quiet, a lingering look at a withered flower, or a faint tremor in her hand. The contrast between the queen and the king was dizzying. The queen commanded obedience and instilled fear. The king offered understanding and offered the possibility of choice. The servant felt torn, caught between the known safety of shadows and the dangerous light of recognition. One evening, the servant found themselves alone in the highest tower, tending to the queen's private library. The room smelled of old parchment and candle wax, the scent of centuries of knowledge lingering in the air. They ran their fingers along the spines of the books, pausing at one that seemed older than the rest. As their hands traced the leather cover, a faint glow shimmered beneath their sleeve. The marks responded to the presence of the king's energy, though he was nowhere in the room. A soft knock at the door made the servant jump. Before they could answer, the door opened slowly, and the king stepped inside. The moonlight through the tall windows made his silhouette appear almost ethereal. "You should not be here," the servant whispered, heart racing. "And yet I am," the king replied gently. "There are truths that cannot wait, and there are chains that must be faced." The servant felt a rush of emotion, fear, longing, and hope all mingling together. The king stepped closer, careful not to touch, but close enough that the heat of his presence was undeniable. "The marks," he said softly, "are not just a curse. They are a key to freedom, to understanding, to power, but only if you are willing to accept what they mean." The servant looked down at their arm, at the faint glow beneath the sleeve. Could they risk trusting him? Could they dare to believe in a world beyond the shadows of service? I do not know," they whispered. "You will," the king said, his voice a comforting anchor. "And I will be here when you are ready. But you must remember, the queen notices more than you think. Every choice has a consequence." The servant nodded, the weight of the night pressing upon them. They understood that their life was changing, that the shadows they had hidden in for so long were no longer enough. The king had seen them. The marks had been found. And with that, the first thread of possibility had been woven into their life, a thread that could lead to freedom or to danger. As the king left the tower, the servant stayed by the window, gazing at the moonlit gardens below. The world outside seemed impossibly vast, filled with storms and secrets, yet the thought of facing it alone felt a little less impossible now. The castle felt heavier than usual. The torches flickered with unusual shadows, and the corridors seemed to hum with a quiet warning. The queen had discovered a change subtle but undeniable. Something in the air had shifted. Her sharp eyes had noticed the king's attention lingering on the servant, and it had awakened a storm inside her. The Alpha Queen, ruler of stone and shadow, did not tolerate disobedience or secrets. The servant moved carefully through the halls, every step measured, every motion precise. Their hands trembled as they carried the queen's robes and arranged the cushions in her chambers. The faint marks on their skin itched beneath the layers of fabric, a reminder that the curse binding them to silence was alive and reacting to the presence of the king. Rumors had already reached the queen's ears, whispers from loyal attendants who feared punishment yet could not remain silent. They spoke of the king watching the servant, of the strange recognition in his gaze. The queen did not respond immediately. She waited, calculating, observing, knowing the moment of confrontation would come, and when it did, it would be decisive. That moment came one evening, as the servant carefully set candles along the throne room. The queen entered silently, her long robes whispering against the floor, her eyes sharp as daggers fixed on the servant. "You have been seen," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of danger. "By him." The servant's hands froze, their heart raced. The king's name had never been spoken aloud like this in the presence of the queen, and now it hung in the air like a warning. I do not understand, your majesty," the servant said softly, bowing. "You understand well enough," the queen replied. Her gaze narrowed, flicking briefly to the marks on their arm, hidden beneath layers of cloth. "Chains are not broken lightly and shadows are not trusted. You have done what you were not allowed." The servant's chest tightened. Fear and shame rose like flames. They had only been seen, only been acknowledged, and yet it was enough to summon the queen's wrath. "Your majesty, the servant began, but the queen cut them off with a gesture. "Silence," she said. "You will speak only when spoken to." "And yet I feel your mind wandering to him." The servant's breath caught. To speak the king's name was dangerous, to feel for him forbidden, and yet the queen saw through it all. "You must choose," the queen said, stepping closer. "Will you remain in your chains, obeying me and hiding your truths? Or will you reach for freedom, knowing the cost it may bring?" The servant felt their knees weaken. Freedom had always been a dream whispered in the quiet of their heart, a fragile thought buried beneath years of service. And now the queen demanded a choice. But the choice was no longer theirs alone. The king had seen the marks, and his presence had ignited something impossible to ignore. I do not know what to choose," the servant whispered. The queen's gaze softened for a moment, almost imperceptibly, revealing the faint sorrow beneath her sternness. "Then know this," she said. "Even chains that seem broken may strike back. Even freedom comes with its price." That night the servant could not sleep. They wandered the moonlit corridors, tracing their fingers over the faint marks that glimmered beneath the sleeves of their robe. The memory of the king's gaze burned in their mind, as did the queen's warning. They had to make a choice, but fear and longing battled within them like storm winds. The next day, the king sought the servant in the quiet of the library. The moon had not yet risen, but the early dawn cast a soft silver glow over the tall shelves of ancient tomes. "You have been seen," he said gently, taking a careful step closer. "I can feel the queen's anger, but that is not the only thing that matters." The servant bowed, head low. I do not know what to do. If I trust you, I risk her wrath. If I obey her, I risk losing what I do not yet understand. Sometimes the only path forward is the one that frightens us most, the king said, placing a hand near the marks, though not touching. The air around them seemed to thrum, the sigils on the servant's skin responding to his presence. You cannot hide forever. Your chain may loosen, but only if you are brave enough to face it. The servant felt a tremor in their chest. Bravery had always seemed impossible. But now, with the king's quiet patience, with his words that offered understanding rather than judgment, they considered it. Perhaps there was a way to confront the curse, to defy the queen's unseen chains, to claim even a fragment of freedom. "Will it hurt?" the servant asked softly, fear threading their voice. "Everything worth doing does," the king replied simply. "But I will stand beside you. You are not alone in this." The words struck a chord deep within them. For the first time, the servant considered that someone could see their burdens and not despise them. Someone could understand the weight of the marks, the history of the curse, the life they had been forced to lead. But danger was never far. That afternoon, the queen summoned the servant to her private chambers. The servant entered, bowing low, heart hammering. "You feel it, do you not?" the queen asked, her voice smooth as silk yet sharper than any blade. "The threads of fate shifting. You are drawn to him. And he notices your marks." "Yes, your majesty," the servant said softly. The queen's eyes narrowed. "Do you think you can play with chains that are older than you, that bind you and perhaps even him?" The servant could not answer. Words failed. They could feel the weight of the queen's power pressing down on them, reminding them of all the years spent in shadows. And yet, the faint hope the king had offered glimmered like a fragile flame in their chest. "You must choose," the queen said, her voice a whisper now, almost intimate, almost cruel. "Obey me and survive in silence, or reach for freedom and risk everything, even your life." The servant bowed, head heavy with the burden of decision. The queen dismissed them, her robes flowing like black water behind her. The servant left the chambers with trembling hands, knowing that the threads of their life were twisting, knotting, and pulling toward a choice they could no longer avoid. Later, in the quiet of the library, the servant and the king met again. This time their conversation was deeper, more urgent. "I know what the queen fears," the king said. "She fears the breaking of chains she does not fully control, but I do not fear it. I only fear that you will deny yourself the freedom you deserve." The servant looked down at their hands, tracing the marks that had always been hidden. I am afraid. Of anger, of punishment, of the unknown." "Fear is natural," the king said softly. "But do not let it dictate your life. Chains are only as strong as we allow them to be. Courage is the key." For the first time, the servant considered the possibility of defiance. Perhaps the curse could be faced, the queen's control challenged, and the marks transformed from chains into keys. But doing so required a choice, a conscious decision to trust the king, to act with intention, to step into danger willingly. The night deepened. The servant and the king remained in the library, the air thick with unspoken understanding. The marks glimmered faintly under the moonlight, and the king's presence seemed to make them pulse with possibility. "You must choose soon," the king said. "The queen will not wait forever, and the longer you delay, the tighter the chains grow." The servant nodded, swallowing hard. The weight of decision pressed on them, heavier than any robe, heavier than any command. And yet, amidst fear and uncertainty, a spark of hope began to burn. The king had offered understanding, guidance, and presence. He had offered trust. Perhaps trust could be returned. That night the servant sat by the window of their small chamber, gazing at the moonlit gardens below. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of distant storms. They traced the faint glow of the marks beneath their sleeves, feeling both fear and longing in equal measure. Freedom was possible, but only if they dared to act. And then a soft knock at the door startled them. The king's voice followed. "Are you ready?" he asked. The servant's heart pounded. Ready? Could they be ready? Could they step from shadows into the uncertain light, knowing the queen's wrath might follow? Could they trust him and trust themselves? The answer trembled in the air between them, fragile and unformed. But it was there, growing, calling them forward. The ruins of the old citadel lay beyond the kingdom, perched on the edge of a cliff where the winds whispered ancient secrets. Mist rolled through shattered stone towers, curling around broken archways and empty courtyards. The servant and the Alpha King walked side by side, their footsteps echoing against the fractured walls. The air was heavy, not just with fog but with anticipation. Tonight they would confront the curse that had haunted the servant for generations. The marks on the servant's skin glimmered faintly beneath the sleeves, responding to the king's presence. They had been hidden for so long, but now, exposed to the night and to him, they pulsed like living threads, guiding the way forward. The servant's chest tightened with both fear and hope. They had chosen to trust him, to step beyond the queen's control, and there was no turning back. The king stopped at the center of the citadel, where the ruins formed a circle of broken stones. "This is where it began," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of history. "Your ancestors, your curse, everything converges here. If it is to be broken, it must be faced in the place where it was born." The servant knelt, tracing the worn stones with trembling fingers. Memories of years in silent service, of shadows and whispers, of fear and longing, flooded through them. They could almost see the hands of those who had come before, chained and powerless, their hope buried beneath layers of obedience. But tonight, the servant would not be silent. Tonight, the marks would speak, not as chains but as keys. "You must focus," the king said softly, kneeling beside them. "The curse is old and powerful. It will test you, your mind, your courage, your heart. But you are not alone." The servant nodded, feeling the warmth of his hand brushing briefly against theirs. That small contact, gentle and steady, bolstered them. For years they had lived in fear, unseen, unheard, unchosen. But now someone saw them, truly saw them, and stood beside them. The night deepened. The mist swirled like living spirits, carrying whispers of old magic. The king instructed the servant to draw the sigils into the circle, tracing each curve and line in the air with trembling fingers. The marks on their skin pulsed in rhythm with their movements, and the ruins seemed to hum in response. "Do not fear," the king whispered. "Fear is the tool the curse uses to bind you. Courage is the key to unbinding it." The servant closed their eyes and focused on the marks, on the chain of generations, on the quiet longing that had followed them like a shadow. They imagined the weight lifting, imagined the chains shattering, imagined freedom stretching before them like sunlight across a misty field. A cold wind swept through the ruins, and the stones beneath their hands vibrated. The servant gasped, the marks flaring brighter than before. Images of the past, of ancestors, of silent obedience, of shadows moving through corridors flashed before their eyes. It was overwhelming, nearly unbearable, yet they clung to the king's voice, to the presence beside them, and to the promise of choice. "Good," the king said, voice steady. "Do not resist. Feel the power, but do not be consumed by it. Let it flow through you and then release it." The servants' hands shook, but they obeyed. The sigils glowed and floated above their skin, forming intricate patterns in the air. They whispered the names of those who had suffered, those who had served, those who had been silenced. With each breath the marks pulsed, and the ruins seemed to respond, echoing with the voice of centuries. And then a sudden pressure bore down on them, the presence of the queen, or perhaps the echo of her power. It was subtle at first, a shadow pressing against the edge of their mind. Then it grew, a force that demanded obedience, that reminded them of chains they had not fully broken, of loyalty and fear entwined. "You can do this," the king said, placing his hand lightly over theirs. The warmth of his touch steadied them. "She may try to pull you back, but your choice is yours, not hers, not anyone else's, yours." The servant took a deep breath and for the first time in their life spoke aloud. I am not yours to command, I am not hers to bind. I choose myself. The words resonated through the ruins, bouncing off stone and mist. The marks flared with blinding light, then dissolved into streams of energy that flowed into the night sky like silver ribbons. The weight of generations lifted from their shoulders, replaced by something lighter: hope, freedom, and strength. The king watched with quiet pride, his eyes reflecting both relief and admiration. You did it, he said softly. You faced the curse and you chose your own path. The servant's chest heaved. They felt different, lighter, yet stronger. The shadows that had clung to them for so long seemed to retreat, leaving space for something new. And yet, even in the quiet triumph, a small part of them remained alert. The queen's influence was not fully gone, it never could be. But for now, the chains that had bound them had been broken. The night settled around them, calm and still. The mist curled gently, and the stars above shone brighter than they ever had in the servant's memory. The king took a step closer and their hands met, fingers brushing with tentative warmth. You were always brave, he said. You just did not know it until now. The servant smiled, a soft, hesitant curve of lips. I could not have done it without you. You never would have had to do it alone, the king replied, his gaze steady. And now the future is yours. For the first time, the servant felt the thrill of possibility stretching before them. The world was wide and full of storms, yes, but also of sunlight, of choices, and of connections that could not be erased by power or fear. They walked through the ruins together, hand in hand, letting the wind carry away the echoes of the past. Every step was lighter, freer, as though the weight of centuries had finally lifted. The marks, once a symbol of chains, had become a memory, a reminder of what had been overcome, not a warning of what must be endured. And yet the queen's presence lingered, like a shadow at the edge of a dream. Though the curse had been broken, her watchful eyes had not disappeared. The servant knew that one day the queen might return, or her influence might ripple through the kingdom again. But for now, the choice had been made, and they had stepped into the light of their own agency. The king led the servant to the highest point of the citadel, where the wind blew freely and the cliffs stretched into the endless horizon. Together they gazed out at the kingdom below, the lights of towns and castles sparkling like stars on the earth. You are free, the king said softly, free to live, to love, to choose, and free to be seen for who you truly are. The servant took a deep breath, letting the wind sweep through their hair. They felt lighter, stronger, alive in a way they had never known. I never imagined this could be possible, they admitted. Anything is possible, the king replied, when you step out of the shadows and claim it. The servant's gaze met his, and in that look, years of fear, longing, and quiet devotion seemed to dissolve. They had been silent for too long, unseen for too long, and now, standing on the edge of possibility, they understood the true meaning of choice and trust. They remained there for a long time, watching the sunrise, letting the light wash over them. The marks were gone, but the lessons remained: courage, trust, and the power to decide one's own fate. The king's presence had been a guiding force, and together they had faced something that could have destroyed them. Instead, they emerged stronger, bonded not by chains, but by shared understanding and the quiet intimacy of trust. The ruins whispered around them, the echoes of centuries of service and shadow fading into silence. The servant realized that life would not be without challenges, that the queen's power still lingered in the world, subtle and unyielding. But the chains that had bound their heart and will were broken, and they had chosen to live for themselves. And in that choice, they discovered something greater than freedom: the possibility of connection, love, and redemption. They could face whatever storms might come, for they were no longer alone, and they had learned that courage could bloom even in the darkest shadows. The servant squeezed the king's hand, a silent promise passing between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As the sun rose over the horizon, spilling gold and fire across the misty ruins, a faint whisper of wind seemed to carry a warning and a blessing alike. And for the first time, the servant truly believed it.